The breakfast rush at Mel's downtown diner hit like a tidal wave every morning at 6:30, and Sarah Chen had exactly 45 seconds to get 4 plates of scrambled eggs, hash browns, and toast to table 7 before the food went cold, and she lost whatever tip might have been waiting for her. She'd been working this shift for 3 years now, ever since her husband died and left her with a mountain of medical debt that seemed to grow taller every month no matter how many double shifts she pulled. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting that particular shade of yellow that made everyone look slightly sick, and the smell of burnt coffee mixed with frying bacon had long since stopped bothering her because it had basically become her perfume at this point. She moved through the cramped space between tables with the precision of someone who'd walked this same path 10,000 times, her body knowing exactly when to pivot, when to squeeze, when to hold the plates higher to avoid clipping someone's head. Table 7 was occupied by the Hendersons, an elderly couple who came in every Thursday and always ordered the same thing, always left exactly 15%, and always told her she looked tired, which she appreciated in a weird way because at least they were honest. She set down their plates with a practiced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes anymore but still conveyed basic human warmth, and headed back toward the kitchen, where she could already hear Miguel shouting something in Spanish about the grill temperature. The diner had been her second home for longer than she cared to admit, its cracked vinyl booths and chipped Formica countertops more familiar to her than her own apartment, which she barely saw anyway since she worked 6 days a week and spent most of her one day off trying to catch up on sleep. The regulars knew her story, or at least pieces of it, the way people in diners always know fragments of each other's lives through overheard conversations and casual comments made while waiting for refills. She was the widow with the dead husband, the woman who never complained, the one who always remembered how you liked your coffee and whether you wanted butter or jam with your toast. But today something felt different, like the air pressure had changed right before a storm, and when she looked up from pouring coffee for table 3, she saw him walk through the door, and even before he opened his mouth she knew this man was going to be trouble. He wore a suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, charcoal grey with subtle pinstripes that caught the light, and his shoes were so polished they reflected the ceiling tiles. His hair was perfectly styled in that way that looked casual but definitely required a professional and probably some expensive product, and he had the kind of watch that didn't tell time so much as it announced net worth. Everything about him screamed money, the kind of money that didn't even think about money, that existed in a completely different universe from the one where Sarah counted quarters to make sure she could afford both groceries and gas. He didn't wait to be seated, just walked directly to the best booth by the window and sat down, pulling out his phone immediately like the physical world around him was just background noise to whatever was happening on his screen. Sarah grabbed a menu and headed over, already feeling the exhaustion settle deeper into her bones because she could spot a difficult customer from across the room after years of doing this job, and this guy had all the warning signs written across his face, like neon signs. She approached the booth with her standard greeting, the one she'd delivered thousands of times, but he didn't even look up from his phone, just held up one finger in a wait gesture that made something hot and angry flicker in her chest before she pushed it down because angry waitresses didn't pay their rent. She stood there for a solid 30 seconds while he finished whatever urgent message was apparently more important than basic human courtesy, and when he finally looked up, his eyes swept over her with the kind of dismissive glance usually reserved for furniture or wallpaper. He ordered without saying please, rattling off a complicated egg white omelette with substitutions that would make Miguel curse in 3 languages, along with a demand for freshly squeezed orange juice even though the diner only had the stuff from concentrate, and water with exactly 3 ice cubes, not 2, not 4, 3. Sarah wrote it all down with the patience of someone who'd dealt with worse, though not by much, and when she politely explained they didn't have fresh squeezed juice, he sighed like she'd just told him the sun wouldn't rise tomorrow, and said the concentrate would have to do, but he'd be adjusting his tip accordingly. The way he said tip made it sound like he was doing her a massive favor just by existing in her section, like his presence was a gift she should be grateful for, and Sarah felt that familiar tightness in her jaw that meant she was clenching her teeth again, the thing her dentist kept warning her about during the appointments she could barely afford. She took the menu back and headed to the kitchen, punching in his order while Miguel took one look at the modifications and started muttering about people who came to diners and expected five-star restaurant service. The morning rush was still going strong, and Sarah had 7 other tables to manage, so she pushed the billionaire to the back of her mind and focused on keeping everyone else happy, refilling coffee and delivering plates and making small talk with people who actually saw her as a human being rather than a service robot. When Sarah brought out his complicated omelette along with his 3 ice cube water and disappointing orange juice, the billionaire took one bite and immediately pushed the plate away with a grimace that looked almost theatrical, like he was performing for an invisible audience. He called her over with a snap of his fingers, actual finger snapping like she was a dog, and when she came to the table he launched into a loud complaint about how the eggs were overcooked and the vegetables weren't diced properly, and the whole thing was basically inedible, and could she please explain to him how an establishment like this stayed in business when the food was barely fit for consumption. His voice carried across the diner, and Sarah could feel other customers turning to look, their conversations dropping off as they tuned into this unexpected drama during their Thursday morning breakfast. She apologized calmly and offered to have Miguel remake it, but the billionaire wasn't interested in solutions. He was interested in making a point, and that point seemed to be that he was better than everyone in this building and wanted to make sure they all knew it. He started talking about how people like her, and he emphasized those words in a way that made them sound like an insult, needed to understand that excellence was a choice and mediocrity was a disease, and if she applied herself with more dedication maybe she wouldn't be stuck slinging hash browns at her age. The diner had gone almost completely quiet now, everyone watching this public dressing down, and Sarah felt heat rising in her face, that particular combination of embarrassment and rage that made her hand shake slightly as she gripped her order pad. He kept going, talking about how he'd built a billion-dollar empire through hard work and high standards, and what was her excuse for being here? Had she just given up on ambition entirely, or was this really the best she could do with her life? Someone at a nearby table muttered something about him being an asshole, but he either didn't hear or didn't care, too caught up in his own performance. Sarah stood there and took it, the way she'd been trained to take it, the way service workers everywhere are trained to smile and nod, and absorb whatever abuse customers feel like dishing out because the customer is always right, even when they're so completely wrong that it defies basic human decency. She could see Mel, the owner, watching from behind the counter, his face tight with anger, but not intervening because intervening might mean losing a customer, and losing customers meant losing money, and losing money meant closing down, and the whole fragile economy of the place rested on not making waves. Something clicked inside Sarah's head, a small sound like a lock opening or a wire snapping, and suddenly she wasn't thinking about tips or rent or medical bills anymore. She was just thinking about how tired she was of being treated like she wasn't a real person, with a real life and real problems that were probably more substantial than anything this man in his expensive suit had ever faced. She set down the coffee pot she'd been holding with deliberate care, making sure it was perfectly centered on the table, and then she looked at the billionaire directly, really looked at him in a way that made him stop mid-sentence because people probably didn't look at him like that very often. She asked him, in a voice that was quiet but carried across the silent diner, if he wanted to know why she was here, if he was genuinely curious about her life, or if he was just performing his superiority for an audience. He opened his mouth, probably to say something cutting, but she kept talking, her words coming faster now, 3 years of swallowed frustration finally finding a release valve. She told him about her husband, about the cancer that took 18 months to kill him, about the insurance that covered almost nothing, about the medical bills that turned into collection notices, about working doubles and triples to try to keep her head above water, while people like him came in and complained about ice cubes. She told him about the regulars who came to this diner, the construction worker who was putting his daughter through college, the single mom who worked 3 jobs, the veteran who couldn't sleep through the night, all of them just trying to survive in a system that seemed designed to grind them down. The billionaire's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, starting with shock that someone was actually talking back to him, then anger at being challenged, then something that might have been shame before settling on defensive confusion, like he was trying to recalculate a situation that had spun completely out of his control. He started to say something about how he'd earned everything he had, but an older man at the counter, A regular named Frank, who'd been a union steward for 30 years, spoke up and said that nobody earns $1 billion. They take it from other people's labor, and suddenly other customers were nodding and adding their own comments. The single mom mentioned how her company's CEO had just bought his third yacht while cutting employee health care, and the construction worker talked about wage theft and contractors who disappeared without paying, and the whole diner transformed into an impromptu forum on economic inequality, with the billionaire trapped in his booth like a defendant facing an unexpected jury. He tried to argue that he'd created jobs and driven innovation and all the other talking points that wealthy people use to justify wealth concentration, but nobody was buying it. Not here, not in a place where people understood exactly how much a dollar was worth, because they had to make each one stretch as far as possible. Sarah watched his face as he realized that his money, his suit, his watch, his whole carefully constructed armor of wealth, meant absolutely nothing in this room full of people who'd seen through it immediately. He looked almost young suddenly, beneath the expensive haircut and the corporate confidence, like a kid who'd been caught doing something wrong and didn't quite understand why everyone was so upset about it. One of the other waitresses, Maria, who'd been working at Mel's for 15 years, came over and stood next to Sarah in a gesture of solidarity, and then another server joined them, and suddenly there was a small wall of service workers standing there in their stained aprons and comfortable shoes, united in their silent judgment. The billionaire pulled out his wallet, and for a moment, Sarah thought he was going to throw money at the situation like money could fix anything, but instead he just sat there holding it, looking lost in a way that suggested this might be the first time in years that his wealth hadn't solved a problem for him. Mel came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron, and walked over to the booth, with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who'd seen a lot of life, and wasn't in any hurry to rush through what needed to be said. He'd owned this diner for 40 years, had bought it from the previous owner who'd run it for 30 years before that, and the place was more than just a business to him. It was a community institution, a place where people came not just for food but for connection and recognition, and the basic human dignity of being seen. He asked the billionaire if he could sit down, not really asking permission so much as announcing his intention, and slid into the booth across from him while the entire diner watched this unfold like it was a play they'd all been waiting to see. Mel started talking in his gravelly voice about the economics of running a small business, about how his profit margins were razor thin, about how he paid his staff as much as he could while still keeping the lights on, about the constant pressure from rising food costs and rent increases and the corporate chains that kept opening nearby with their cheaper prices and their exploitation labor practices. He talked about how every person working in this diner was there because they needed to be, because life had handed them situations that required them to work jobs that society looked down on while simultaneously depending on those jobs to function. He told the billionaire that Say was one of the most reliable employees he'd ever had, that she showed up early and stayed late and treated customers with kindness, even when they didn't deserve it, and that she'd probably forgotten more about hard work than most executives would ever learn. The billionaire started to say something about market forces and competitive compensation, but Mel held up his hand and kept talking, explaining that the problem wasn't individuals, it was a system that allowed some people to accumulate more wealth than they could spend in 10 lifetimes while other people worked full-time jobs and still couldn't afford rent. He wasn't angry, just matter of fact, laying out the reality of economic inequality with the calm certainty of someone stating obvious truths. He mentioned how the neighborhood had changed over the years, how the people with money kept pushing out the people without, how his diner was probably going to get bought out eventually by some developer who'd turn it into luxury condos, how everything was always changing, but somehow the gap between rich and poor just kept getting wider. The billionaire sat there for a long time after Mel finished talking and went back to the counter, just sitting with his cold omelette and his 3 ice cubes melting into 4 and then 5 and then just water. Sarah had gone back to work, serving her other tables and refilling coffee and doing all the things she did every day, but she could feel his eyes following her movements, and it wasn't the dismissive observation from before, it was something different, like he was actually seeing her for the first time as a complete human being rather than a supporting character in his own story. Eventually he called her over, not with a finger snap but with a hesitant raised hand, and when she came to the table he apologized and it sounded genuine. Not the corporate apology that didn't mean anything, but the kind of apology that came from actual recognition of harm caused. He told her he'd been wrong about the eggs and about everything else, and that he'd spent so long in boardrooms and executive suites that he'd forgotten what life looked like for people who weren't insulated by wealth. Sarah didn't accept the apology immediately because she wasn't sure she wanted to, wasn't sure he'd end it yet, but she nodded to show she'd heard him, which was something at least. He asked if he could buy breakfast for everyone in the diner, and she almost laughed because of course that was his solution. Throw money at the problem, but then she realized maybe that was the only tool he had right now, and maybe it was okay to let him use it if it meant people got free breakfast out of his education. She told Mel, who announced to the diner that this gentleman was covering everyone's meal this morning, which got a small round of applause that was more ironic than grateful, but people weren't gonna turn down free food. The billionaire left a tip that was probably more than Sarah made in a month, which was generous but also kind of missed the point, because the point wasn't that she needed his charity, the point was that she deserved to be treated with respect regardless of how much money she had or didn't have. He stood to leave, and before he walked out he turned back and said something about how this had been the most valuable breakfast he'd ever had, which was the kind of thing rich people said when they'd learned something that poor people had always known. After the billionaire left, the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm, conversations resuming and dishes clattering and Miguel complaining about the grill, but something had shifted in the air, like everyone there had witnessed something important, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. Sarah finished her shift the way she always did, cleaning her tables and counting her tips and saying goodbye to the regulars, but she felt different, lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't even known was there until it was gone. The story spread through the neighborhood over the following days, changing and growing in the retelling the way stories do, until it became a kind of local legend about the time a waitress at Mel's put a billionaire in his place and taught him something about humanity. People came by to meet Sarah, to hear her version of events, to tell her their own stories about times they'd been dismissed or degraded by people with more money than sense. The billionaire, whose name Sarah eventually learned was Marcus Whitfield, didn't come back to the diner, but a week later Mel received an anonymous donation that covered 2 months of rent, and they all knew where it came from even though there was no name attached. Sarah didn't know if Marcus had actually changed, if one conversation in a diner could really shift someone's entire worldview, or if he'd just go back to his executive suite and forget all about the people he'd met during his momentary brush with reality. She hoped he'd learned something, hoped that maybe he'd treat his employees better, or think twice before cutting benefits to improve profit margins, but she wasn't naive enough to think one moment of shame could undo a lifetime of privilege and conditioning. What mattered more to Sarah was how the experience had changed her, had reminded her that she wasn't just a waitress, wasn't just defined by her circumstances or her struggles or the medical debt that still sat on her shoulders like a concrete blanket. She was a person who'd survived genuine tragedy, who'd kept going when giving up would have been easier, who'd maintained her compassion and her dignity in a world that constantly tested both. The diner kept running the way it always had. People kept coming in for breakfast and coffee and the kind of community that only existed in places where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Sarah kept working her shifts and serving her tables and treating people with the kindness they deserved. Nothing had really changed, except everything had changed in that subtle way that real growth happens, not with dramatic gestures but with small shifts in perspective that compound over time. She still worried about money, and she still worked too hard, and she still got tired. But now, when she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror at the end of a long shift, she saw someone who'd stood up for herself and her community, someone who'd refused to be diminished, someone who'd taught a billionaire that wealth couldn't buy respect or understanding or the kind of wisdom that came from actually living in the world, rather than floating above it in a bubble of privilege.